Oh no, we're recording. Hi, everyone. So my name is Jennifer Chan. I'm the Scholarly Communication Librarian at UCLA, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Marty Brennan, who's our Copyright Librarian, as well as Roxanne Peck, who is the Librarian for Digital Collection Management. I promise I know this lady. And we're here today to present our presentation on walled gardens and digital playgrounds, who's playing in the world of text and data mining. So just to give a little bit of context, the first thing we want to say is thank you to everyone who showed up today. We were talking amongst ourselves and wondering if we would actually have anyone since we were late on a Friday afternoon, but it's good to see all of your faces. Of course, then they told us they were recording this, so we got a little nervous after that, I think. So hopefully, I think the information that we'll present to you today will be of some interest and maybe even of some benefit to what libraries are doing in the area of text and data mining. So before we get into the meat of the things, I just want to make a few other additional acknowledgments. First is of Hillary Miller, who's the Scholarly Communications Outreach Librarian at VCU Libraries. Also, our boss, Angela Riggio, who is the head of Scholarly Communication and Licensing at UCLA Library, and Kendra Godwin, who is the 2016-2017 Associate Fellow at the National Library of Medicine and our former SCL unit intern. So this, just to give you a little bit of context, is a new survey that was in part derived from a survey that was conducted by Hillary Miller in 2015 as part of her thesis work at UNC Chapel Hill. And what brought us here to this point was one of these. We got a notice about a license breach that had occurred when one of our student researchers at the School of Business basically triggered a vendor's breach alert while they were conducting some research. And they were doing a lot of downloading of just different records that we had access to under our licensing agreement. And we felt that the activity was certainly justified in terms of it being legitimate research activity. But of course, that got us to thinking, what other things are going on in the area of text and data mining, and what were libraries doing at other institutions, and what was the reaction of content aggregators to text and data mining practices. So, a little bit of background about the survey itself. There was a lot of information that we had sort of in the aggregate about the emerging potential for text and data mining in information science. But there was actually really very little information about what libraries were doing with respect to the rights aspects of text and data mining that I'll refer to from now on as TDM. So the UCLA librarians, our motley crew, decided to investigate. And one of the first things that we hit upon was the discovery of Hillary Miller's thesis, which spurred our connection and collaboration. So we had some questions from Hillary's thesis that we decided to repeat as part of our survey because we really wanted to find out if, in fact, there were any trends that were happening among research libraries. And we also added several new questions to our survey. We also conducted several interviews with representatives from content aggregators to see what the state of thinking was about TDM arrangements for them. So we'll also go ahead at the end of this presentation, towards the end, and share some of that information with you as well, anonymous information. So just a little bit about the methodology. We did repeat several questions from the Miller thesis, but we also conducted the survey in SurveyMonkey with several new questions. The questions were emailed to a list that was curated by us of identified ARL librarians that were working in the area of electronic resources acquisitions. Additionally, we sent out the survey to several relevant listservs like LibLicense, ERIL, Scalcom, and Alex Central. So it's quite possible that some of you in this room may have answered our survey. If so, thank you very much, and you don't have to raise your hand. You can remain anonymous. So our survey was live for about 3 weeks, from September 14th to October 7th. And we actually got what we think was a pretty good response rate, so thank you all. We received about 108 overall responses. 94 of those responses were from U.S. academic libraries. 69 of the respondents worked directly in the area of licensing and electronic resources, and 56 of those respondents were from ARL libraries. So a lot of the questions were either multiple choice, but we did have a few open-ended questions. So as you might imagine, as we got more into that area of the survey, some of our response rates began to kind of dwindle down a little bit. Also, one of the things that I will mention is that in comparison, the Miller response rate, she had about 89 participants for her survey, and about 56% qualified and actually completed the survey. So I think we got a better completion rate here. One other thing that I just want to mention is that we excluded Canadian institutions from this particular survey. The reason for that is that we would have had to include fair dealing in addition to talking about fair use. So that would have changed some of the considerations that we had in analyzing the results of the survey. So in order to kind of clean up that data, we excluded those institutions from this particular response. So now I will introduce again Marty Brennan, and he'll go over some of the actual questions of the survey. We won't go through all of the questions, of course, but I think these are some of the more pithy responses that we had.
Thanks, Jennifer. So the first two questions we want to talk about is fair use clauses and TDM as fair use. We got a 77% response that people do try to include fair use clauses in license agreements if they are not present. That is a slight uptick from the Miller survey in 2015. And we also asked, do you consider TDM to be a fair use of copyrighted material? 65% said yes, an increase over Miller again, and noted that there was a decrease in the amount of respondents who didn't know if it qualified for fair use. So there's just been a greater understanding of this, and people coming more to the conclusion of, yes, they believe this is a fair use of the material that we license. But we didn't ask, we realized as we were going through the results, the next logical question. Did you ever enable or facilitate a TDM project based on a fair use assertion rather than something articulated in the license or otherwise? So a question for the next paper, if anybody wants to take that one up. We asked, when you're looking for information on licensing text and data mining rights, which resources have you found helpful? Miller also asked this question and found very similar results. Although she did not ask about the ARL, TDM, and fair use issue brief, which, if memory serves, was not yet published when Miller did her survey. As you can see, it's fairly all over the map. I think the only conclusion to be drawn from this is that no one's written the book on this yet, because no one's looking for the book on this. So if you want to write a book, another good idea. We asked, does your library have model or preferred license language that guides your negotiations for electronic resource acquisitions? In 2015, the response was 60%. In our survey, it jumped up to 74%. And if you narrow it to ARL respondents only, it's 86%. Okay, so that to us is a very good, strong indication that model license language is becoming the norm ever more as time goes by. Has your library attempted to negotiate text and data mining rights, specifically TDM rights, in a license agreement? Only 46% attempted in 2015. In our survey, it goes up to 54%. If you focus it only on ARL respondents, it's 76%. We asked, has your library successfully added language concerning TDM to your model license or added a TDM clause to the vendor license? In 2015, Miller phrased this a little differently and only asked about the model license, and we asked about putting a clause in the vendor license. Only 40%, according to Miller, put things in their model license about TDM. But in our response, we got 52%, and specifically in ARL libraries, there was a 72 response rate. So as you can see, we're seeing a lot more action on these topics in ARL libraries, people being a lot more proactive there, and it makes a lot of logical sense that there is more interest and activity in a research library setting than the general university library settings. So I'm sure you can all read that perfectly. What circumstances prompted you to negotiate for text and data mining? I can tell you, I know you can't. In the first three responses, you were either approached by a faculty member, a student, or a researcher with a TDM request. So when you group those all together, those are, user requests for TDM rights. There's also, the next one is, and the three of those responses are well over 50%, although people could have chosen more than one response to this question. The biggest response was by a librarian or library administration asked you to approach or to pursue these rights. And when you specifically narrow that to ARL libraries, it's even higher. It's 56% of ARL TDM requests are driven by library administration. So it's an interesting dual drivers in force. There are certainly a lot driven by user requests, but in ARL libraries and specifically, we have administration that is pushing for this as a priority. So these three questions are kind of tied together. So we push them onto the same slide. Has a publisher or content provider offered TDM rights for an additional charge? Now, Miller didn't ask any of these questions, so we only have responses from our survey. And 64% of our respondents said yes. Content providers had offered TDM rights for an additional charge. There was a greater response from ARL libraries. Then we asked, did you pay that additional charge? And 54% said yes. 71% of ARL libraries said yes. And further, we said, does your library routinely pay for TDM on behalf of researchers? And the answer is almost universally no. They do not routinely pay. But there was a lot of comments on that question that it depends on the current budget situation. It depends on will those materials be made available to anyone beyond the researchers, if it's something that we can purchase on behalf of the wider institution and has some potential for wider use, then yes, libraries are willing to. But if it's to accomplish a specific project, the libraries are not likely to pony up that dough. So also on the additional charges, the question in the middle there, it's happening more heavily in the ARL libraries, but it's revealed in the comments that there's a wide variety of extra charges, not just a simple extra licensing fee, if such fees are happening at all. It's more likely delivery fees, hardware purchases, and et cetera. For example, we have agreed to cover charges for processing and materials such as a hard drive. Another respondent paid a nominal fee for delivery of digital files in a different format, mere cost recovery. Another said, we have sometimes paid for data delivery, but not for the rights themselves. Our stance is that we already have those rights. In other words, quote, the right to read is the right to mine, unquote. And this is a complicated slide. We struggled with how to represent this, but we asked what respondents thought of these different proposed methods of simplifying the process of TDM arrangements. Broad approaches to making the situation better for all involved. And the first one, saying commonly agreed licensing terms for text and data mining that are non-commercial and have a clear research focus. 77% of respondents strongly agreed that this would be a good thing. An additional 10% simply agreed. So that it was overwhelmingly positive that that would be a good development. And the next three also got pretty good, strong responses, adding up to over 50% agreement about clarity of the copyright status of derivative works generated by TDM, a centralized platform to handle permission requests for multiple publishers and vendors, and a centralized TDM platform for which to access content from multiple publishers and vendors. However, there was a strong disagreement on the last method, which is how we're mostly doing it these days, publishers handling requests for text and data mining rights on a case-by-case basis. So there's pretty strong agreement that that is not a good way to go forward. Some of these other ideas were met with some generally positive agreement, though. Okay, so then the rest of this survey, we tried to get down to one-off arrangements. So we posed with this question: when TDM rights are not present in a license, has your library successfully facilitated a use of that license product for a specific TDM project? And this goes back to what spurred our survey in the first place, that student in the business school who was downloading thousands of articles in order to do a text and data mining project. The intent of this student was completely within the spirit of our license, but technically it was in violation because he was taking things at a greater rate than we expect people to be using these materials. So we tried to negotiate with that content provider, and in that case we were unsuccessful in getting the student access. In other cases we have been successful, and I know that that varies from institution to institution and situation. So we were trying to get to how many people have done this. There have been 33% response rate overall, 46% response rate at ARL. So it's happening more at ARL than other places. In fact, if you look at academic libraries in our survey outside of ARL, only 7% are doing it, or have experience doing it, I should say. And so when we got to this question and these following questions that deal with one-off TDM arrangements, we got considerably less responses. There was less people that were doing it, and so we're not going to show you a lot of the data in numerical representation because it's such a smaller amount, and just try to get to some of the anecdotes that come out of it. Several responses indicated that familiarity with TDM among content aggregators varied, and not all understood the role of TDM in research, nor were able or willing to support. So a lot of librarians had to get on the phone with that content aggregator and literally explain what text and data mining was and how it's a reasonable use of the content and a growing part of research endeavors at universities. In at least one case, a planned research project was unable to move forward because of a failure to come to an agreement. And that's from the survey. That's not the anecdote that we experienced at UCLA, but something that was on the survey. And there's a gap in cooperation that may have disciplinary implications. It seems to be that there are a greater support for TDM in the humanities, and it's more difficult to pull off in the STM fields. And finally, from the survey, we asked a couple of questions that we're trying to get at the services around TDM that libraries provide. So we asked, does your library have a plan in place to notify relevant librarians and researchers of resources that do have TDM rights? In 2015, Miller asked the same question, and only 16% of libraries responded that they had a plan. Our response saw a big jump up to 41%, and if you look specifically at RL, it's 52%. But these plans vary widely. From ERM databases that include this information, to informational LibGuides, to email alerts, to faculty newsletters. We also asked, does your library provide server space, technical assistance, or any level of consultation for the research process if the researcher has a TDM request? Overall, Miller didn't ask this question in 2015, by the way. We had a 40% response of yes, and a higher response rate from ARL. And if you look at the comments response of this question, it's also really a wide variety of services and depth that librarians will go into in order to support such projects. So that's the basics of the survey, and we will have time to go into questions. But now I'm going to turn it over to Roxanne, who's going to talk more about our conversations with content aggregators.
Oops. Okay. Jumping ahead. As Jennifer mentioned, we engaged in conversations with a few randomly selected content aggregators, and these are some of the consensus points that we found in our conversations with them. And first, starting off, the content aggregators are aware of TDM, so it's not something strange or new to anyone. I think everyone said they had a deep awareness of it. And one of the things we learned was that content aggregators are receiving requests directly from our researchers, meaning there's little librarian involvement. In our discussions, we didn't get that amount quantified for us, but I think it is a concern that we are getting left out of the process. And that's something that at UCLA we certainly want to try and address. One of the other things that we discussed was rights, and of course this is a big issue because most content owners do not understand the nature of TDM, and that's a little bit of what Marty's already alluded to in the responses. But of course, that's not the only issue for our vendors because they have to do some behind-the-scenes work to support TDM requests. So there is an impact on our content aggregators and vendors. But under the area of support, these are some of the things that are happening with those content aggregators. They're creating APIs to mine the content, and some are supplying CD-ROMs so the researcher can get what they requested and have their own specific environment to work in and do their TDM projects. And of course, TDM can only be conducted on the content that is licensed and owned by the library. Of course, that makes sense, but there are a lot of digital purchases that we've made where we have maybe parts 1, 2, 5, and 6. So, we have to let the researcher know that they can't TDM everything in those particular resources. And one of the vendors that we talked to does contact librarians when they receive a TDM request from our institution. And just to close out here, only one of our vendors does not charge for TDM. The other vendors we talked to do charge that cost recovery fee, which of course they do not consider to be excessive. Okay. To kind of bring it all to a close, these are some of our main takeaways that we have. ARL libraries are confronting this issue to a greater extent, which makes sense given the level of research that's conducted in those large academic research institutions. And as Marty pointed out, the trends in the data across both surveys show that engagement on this issue continues to increase even incrementally. And our third point here is the libraries are not willing to pay for extraordinary or excessive TDM arrangements in general, and that really came from the comments section of our survey. And, this is kind of like what we've collectively talked about, how to move forward, and, can we start the discussion to leverage our collective experience for best practices, and where should we start? Really. And I think an important takeaway for us is, of course, continuing the conversation with our content aggregators, because we can't go it alone. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, our researchers are sometimes going direct to the content aggregators. So, I think it's important to think about how we might incorporate those TDM requests into a service option for our users, so everyone's kept in the loop in the process. And there we go. So we do have our survey results up on Google Docs. And as you can see here in the note, our open comments are stripped out for confidentiality reasons. But we would love to take questions or comments if you have anything for us. Thank you.
Yes, we'd appreciate if you use the microphone. The session's being recorded.
I have a couple of questions. I'm short. I don't know if this is connecting.
You can angle the microphone
Awesome.
down. There you go.
Okay. So one, did any comments about NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, about pricing? Did any of that sort of show up in the survey comments? And the second piece is, so you talk about libraries are not willing to pay excessive or extraordinary. Do you have any kind of sense for what that is on a percentage or a dollar amount? So is it anything over maybe $1,500? I don't know if any of that came out.
First of all, are you a content aggregator?
I'm a librarian.
Okay,
So
just
we have
checking
done
first.
No. So
because my answer will be different.
Absolutely. We've done this once, and we were charged, I think it was about $1,500 for data collection in a different format on a specific hard drive, and we even had to negotiate whether we could make a copy for preservation, sort of backup purposes. Yeah.
Well, I can say that we didn't see anything in the comments about non-disclosure of rates. That just is a concept that didn't come up. Wouldn't be surprised if there's some non-disclosures happening in some places. But the librarians that answered apparently ignored those ideas. But no, we really didn't get a lot of detail about what specific amounts that people are paying anyway. What we did get is a varied response in what they're willing to do. And we got some details from content aggregator conversations about the amounts that they're asking for, and that varies a lot too. It really comes down to a situational thing because a lot of these are one-offs. There is one content aggregator that stands on principle that they want to make this content available for free, or the content available for TDM purposes for free if you've already licensed it, or at no additional charge, not free. It's more like a gift with purchase than it is free. So I'm not sure if did I cover all that? I think so.
Yes, it does. And I'll take a look at the original survey to get a sense for.
Okay. It appears we've answered all of the questions and nobody has. Well, we do have some questions that we have that we've looked at as questions for further research based upon this. And is that on the next slide there? You might as well just forward it. As I said earlier, if you consider TDM a fair use and a fair use clause is in your license, then are you exercising that right? Can we get a show of hands of people that are doing or know of TDM projects that have happened on your campus as an expression of fair use? That's good. I'm glad to see that. And I think it's a question that we need to be asking more to kind of push it into the forefront of our discussions. Where are researchers conducting TDM if not against licensed database and journal content? I mean, we certainly see lots of interesting TDM research being done on content on the open web because it makes more sense. How can librarians get more involved assisting researchers with this process? I know this is something that we're all really just realizing is something that the library needs to get more involved in. But there are certainly lots of researchers that are going ahead without us, not even thinking of the library as a place to get services on this. Should librarians get involved? And if researchers know about this content, would they use it? So if we were to just go ahead and do this based on our own initiative, let's get TDM rights for everything that we license. Will it actually be picked up and used by the researchers on our campus? It's certainly not sweeping the academy as a concept, but we are seeing increasing anecdotes every year, at least at UCLA, and hearing about it more and more at conferences. Who should pay for TDM? Should it be an aspect of our licenses and not increase the price at all? That's my perspective. I'm sure the content aggregators might disagree with that, but not all do. If aggregators received more requests for the content, would they pursue permission from content owners? And this is, when we talk to content aggregators, this was really the issue that prevented them from doing it flat out. The one that we said provides it for free, it went through the effort of turning to their content provider, the publishers that they work with, and made sure that this was part of the rights that they secured so that they could turn around and license it to others. And that is a standalone aggregator as far as we can tell. Everybody else pointed to it at least as something that was a very work-intensive thing that blocked them from really providing these rights in the first place. And if you're talking about things like newspaper content providers, some of them claim that they just wouldn't be able to get those rights at all because the newspapers are providing their own service of TDM or going through different routes to do that. So that is a major issue that is, not inconsequential and not completely the fault of content aggregators either. Last one, what economic model will emerge around TDM? And that is the big question that we are stuck in the swamp in right now. That's a very Charleston reference there. So we're hoping to see more discussion on this. We submitted a session to Electronic Resources and Libraries in Austin in the spring. Did we get accepted?
No, it's still voting.
Still voting on it. So if you want to talk about this more, vote on our session at the ERNL website. And we'll be doing more with what we talked about with the content aggregators at that session, and trying to focus that session more on their side of the equation than ours. So, any other questions, comments, anything?
Hi, I'm Molly Keener from Wake Forest University. We have not done anything with TDM at Wake. We have purchased data sets specifically created for TDM, but we have not added on TDM or requested TDM for a project. Can you explain for those like me who've not done this what it looks like when that gets added on? Technically, you mentioned, Marty, the gift with purchase model. I mean, do you get like an extra thing that you then have to sort of curate and add to your list of resources? What sort of responsibility is the library taking on to add on TDM access, I guess.
Are you talking specifically about licensing or?
Any or all of the above, if you could just sort of give an overview of what this might look like, not just in the licensing, but like actually getting the researchers access to the corpus.
Okay, so I mean, first of all, of course, it would start with the licensing as long as that's articulated and everyone signed off on that. And then we usually involve a subject liaison librarian with the researcher, and we have that subject liaison librarian kind of walk them through the process of getting them the access or connection with the content aggregator, and then making sure they have the material, whether it's the CD-ROM or some other kind of one-off access, and then kind of seeing that to the conclusion. And then, so it's a, labor-intensive process on all sides, I think. Does that help clarify a little bit? Okay.
A little more on that, just that there really are no standard ways to go forward with that. There's different ways to put the language in the license so that your users have the right to use the content in this manner. There are different ways to set up one-off arrangements for a specific researcher. There is no price model, no matter what the content aggregator tells you. There is no standard price. In fact, there are many content aggregators that add no price to their license. Well, there is one. I wish there were many. Any comments on that?
Yeah, so it really depends on the nature of how you're getting that content delivered to with these different arrangements. If it's something that's being set up on their server for you for temporary access, that's going to be different than if you're getting actual hardware or just to actually deal with on your own equipment and your own infrastructure. So all those variables, unfortunately, lead us to it really depends.
And we're over time, but we'll take one more question.
Yeah, I just had a question. When you were talking to the content aggregators, if any of them are thinking about offering this as a service, because, the ARLs are probably equipped to do this, but if you're a smaller academic and you want the data, your researchers want to mine it, but you don't have the technical support to do it, I was just wondering if that came up at all.
I just want to note for the record that Gail giggled at the question. And that is really the title of our session, Walled Gardens and Digital Playgrounds. In some of those discussions with content aggregators, they talked about setting up a separate area, separate from their usual access to their content, where they load content for the specific research project that's being called for, and then our researcher can log into that space in order to conduct their research. So that is one emerging model at the content aggregator level. And it can happen that way, or they can just deliver the data to you, usually on a hard drive, and with guarantees that the data won't be spread beyond a certain way and only used in a certain manner. So there are different ways that this can go forward. Okay, one more question. I said that was the last, but whatever. Oh, okay.
Bob Schwartzwalder, Stanford University. It would seem to help a little bit to really define the scope of some of the projects. Most of what we see with current content are people really developing algorithms, and we'll hit this a lot of time where it can be any content for them. They just need some massive amount of content because they're developing algorithms to work in this area. Our work with UNO is an example of that, of developing an inference engine and increasing the amount of content to perfect those algorithms. Where we see something really based upon the content, it often is based on a digitization program. One of our faculty efforts called the Republic of Letters is an example of taking literary luminaries and looking at their letters to each other and then drawing the connections between who had an influence on whom, and it falls well out of copyright because it's hundreds of years old. But I think what really helps is to begin to define the use cases to see how people are using it, because this will help set some of the terms and conditions for the future.
Right. Certainly, when people are doing research to pin down best practices in TDM and how to structure an algorithm to do such searches, we really encourage them to find freely available content and not mess with something that we need to pin down in a license. We're really concerned with, there was an instance with Ancestry.com, for example, where someone was looking at immigration patterns of a certain ethnic group in Pennsylvania from 1850 to 1900. And so that database really had to be hit in order to accomplish that. So, you know,
Well, and I think this is one of the roles of librarians, because we hit a similar thing and we use digitized maps to find some of the same information. So you can look at migrations of people by analyzing place names. And it wasn't something that the person had originally thought of doing, but actually provided another alternative. And as librarians, we see a broad corpus of materials. So often we can find alternatives that fit very well within terms of use. So one of the questions about what is the role of the library, that's one.
right.
Yeah.
And I would add to that, I mean, there's two ways to diverge from that. It's a shame that we have to discourage researchers from going after certain content because it's not convenient and not specifically in the rights that we've already paid an excessive amount of money for. And I'm forgetting the other direction.
Not in your head, Marty.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I made it all the way through, and I flubbed on the last one.
I just wanted to add, we didn't really get into this deeply, but the open responses that we received really did also reflect, and we mentioned this a little bit, that there are differences between the different disciplines and how this data and how these techniques are being used. So in the cases of things like in the STEM fields, we really do need to get access to very specific data, and in those cases, the data is in fact under more restrictive conditions from concurrent aggregators for whatever reason. And when that's the case, that makes these other alternatives less viable for very particular projects. But at the same time, it also demonstrates that within TDM, these techniques are being applied all over academia. So from humanities, social sciences, to our STM fields. So I think it's really important to kind of see that and recognize that there are these differences. And in moving forward to that, kind of trying to tailor what our responses are as librarians in this field to those differences.
No.
All right, well, I want to, on behalf of the three of us, thank you all for coming, and please let's keep this conversation going as we move forward. Thanks a lot, everybody.
So much.